The Seven Wonders of the Ancient World by Edgar J. Banks. The Walls of Babylon.
Please like this video so that more people have access to this content. Enjoy and also follow this channel to see other videos about art.
In the old city of Damascus, you climb to the hump of a tall, fleet dromedary. With guides and guards about you, you ride through the covered bazaars, crowded with dark-faced Arabs in strange costumes, and along the narrow winding lane, which was once called the Street Called Straight. Leaving the city by the eastern gate, and passing a small village or two, you ascend the hill to the plateau, and before you, as far as the eye can reach, stretches the great Arabian desert. With mingling fear and wonder at the mystery always lying beyond the desert horizon, you tap gently with your heel upon the shoulder of the dromedary to urge her on. At first, paying little heed to you, she hesitates and glances anxiously about the desert, as if in search of an enemy. Now and then she reaches down to graze the thorny argul along the way. As the taps upon her shoulder are repeated, she stretches out her long neck, and with long strides makes for the eastern horizon. She realizes that she is bound on the long journey across the desert. Hour after hour she bears you over the hard, monotonous plain. The Damascus mosques and their minarets sink beneath the western sky. The desert about you shows no signs of life, only a tall column of whirling sand, rearing its head until it is lost in the blue above, moves majestically along. In the distance your eyes detect a beautiful lake, with shores fringed with trees. But soon the phantom lake vanishes, while others, still farther beyond, appear and vanish in rapid succession. Like a great ball of fire, the sun sinks in the west. The stars come out one by one and shine brighter than elsewhere, as if to light you on your way. Late at night, the weary dromedary kneels, and on the ground close beside her you lie down to sleep. Again, long before the stars have been scattered by the morning sun, you are on your way. Day after day you travel on, scorched by the heat of noonday, shivering in the chill winds of the night. 2 weeks pass, and at last you stand on the eastern edge of the plateau, gazing down upon the great Euphrates winding along the valley beneath. You have crossed the Arabian desert, the first stage of the long journey to the walls of Babylon. Here, in the valley, the water is sweet and the food abundant. For 10 days you follow down the river, through little villages and black tent encampments, among scenes of strange Arab life which never lose their charm. Everywhere the valley is dotted with the mounds of buried cities carefully guarding the secrets of the centuries of long ago. At last you see before you a mound rising like a mountain from the level plain. Your journey is at an end. Before you is Babylon, the gate of God, as the old name means. About you is all that remains of the second of the 7 wonders of the world. Babylon, even in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, was an old, old city. There is a Hebrew tradition that it was the oldest of all cities, but now we know that great empires flourished and passed away before Babylon was built. Old King Sargon I, who may have lived as early as 3800 BC, seems to have been the first to mention Babylon, and one of his inscriptions seems to say that he built the city and gave it its name. But in those very early days, Babylon was little more than a shrine, surrounded with mud huts and date palms. It was about 2250 BC, when the great Hammurabi made it his capital, that it became the chief city of Babylonia. Its history for the next 1500 years or more is obscure. We know the names of its kings, and the records speak of long wars with the Assyrians. In the year 689 BC, Sennacherib, king of Nineveh, captured Babylon, tore down its palaces and temples and walls, and scraped even the foundations of the city, into the river. The place where the old city had stood for 3,000 years again became a desert. Esarhaddon, the son of Sennacherib, was the next king of Nineveh. He rebuilt Babylon that, in accordance with the ancient custom, he might be crowned in the sacred city. When Esarhaddon died, one of his sons, Samas-Summukin, was made king of Babylon. Another son, Assurbanipal, or the great Sardanapalus of the Greeks, became the king of Nineveh. War broke out between the two brothers, and again Babylon was captured. In 626, Assurbanipal died, and in that same year Nabopolassar, the father of the great Nebuchadnezzar, became the king of Babylon. The building of the Babylon so famous in history began with Nabopolassar. He enlarged the old city, erected temples, and began the construction of its walls. In 606, Nineveh, the old enemy of Babylon, fell, never to rise again. The next year, in 605, Nabopolassar died, and Nebuchadnezzar succeeded him to the throne. He continued the building operations of his father until Babylon became the greatest city of its age, and surrounded it with walls the like of which no other city has ever seen. Nebuchadnezzar, or Nebuchadrezzar, as his name should be spelled, was the greatest character in Babylonian history. But about his name so many legends have grown that it is sometimes difficult to learn the facts of his life. Early, he married Amuhia, a daughter of the Median king. His military career began while he was still the crown prince, and his father was on the throne. In 605, at the head of the Babylonian army, he defeated the Egyptians in the famous battle of Carchemish, the old Hittite capital, and drove them from Asia. Then Syria and Palestine were added to his future empire. In 597, when he sent his army to Jerusalem, he won the hatred of the Jews by taking Jehoiakin, the king, captive. 11 years later, in 586, he destroyed the sacred Hebrew city, transported the Jews to Babylon, and brought the Hebrew kingdom to an end. Centuries afterward, even to this day, Jewish mothers teach their children to hate his name. They tell how he forced the exiles to carry heavy bags of sand across the desert to increase their burdens, how he cast Hebrew lads into a fiery furnace and into the lion's den, and how, in punishment for all his wickedness, he became a calf, and for 7 years grazed the grass in the fields about the city. Late in his life, in 567, he invaded Egypt. During all his reign there was little peace in his great, mixed, turbulent empire. The walls of the palaces of many of the Assyrian kings were lined with great stone slabs engraved with reliefs and sometimes with the portrait of a king. But in Babylonia, stone was difficult to obtain, and sculptures were very rare. Therefore, it was useless to hope that Nebuchadnezzar's portrait would be found on his palace walls. However, several decades ago, an Oriental appeared at the Berlin Museum, offering for sale a small cameo engraved with a helmeted head of a Greek type. About the head was an inscription in Greek characters saying that the face was that of Nebuchadnezzar. The museum authorities believed that the cameo was one of the many spurious objects which the Eastern forgers were constantly sending to Europe, yet they took an impression of it and returned it to its owner. Years later, when the archaeologists could readily distinguish the false from the true, it was recognized that the cameo was genuine, and that it bore the likeness of the great king. Unfortunately, the little stone seal, perhaps the only one to preserve for us his features, appears to have been lost forever. Its impression shows the face of a beardless young man, intelligent and refined. The eyes are suggestive of the Semitic, the nose is of the Greek type, the lips are thin, the chin prominent. The neck is that of a strong, vigorous man. Such was the appearance of the builder of the walls of Babylon. Religion and cruelty frequently go hand in hand, and Nebuchadnezzar was exceedingly religious. Though a great warrior, it was not for his military deeds that he was best known. He was fond of restoring the ruined temples of the old Babylonian cities, and most of the records which have come from his time speak chiefly of his deeds of piety. Read the introduction to any of his inscriptions, of which the following is one, and you will call him vain and proud, but his scribe wrote it in the manner customary for the scribes of those days to write of their royal masters. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the exalted prince, the favorite of Marduk, the lofty Patesi, the beloved of Nabu, the arbiter, the possessor of wisdom, who seeks out the path of their divinity, who reverences their lordship, the untiring governor, who ponders daily concerning the maintenance of Esagil and Ezida, and is continually anxious for the shrines of Babylon and Borsippa, the wise, the pious, the maintainer of Esagil and Ezida, the firstborn son of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon, am I. However cruel and religiously intolerant Nebuchadnezzar may have been, he was undoubtedly the greatest builder the world has ever seen. There is scarcely one of the thousands of ruined mounds in Babylonia which does not contain bricks bearing his name. There is scarcely a royal record from his reign which is not chiefly occupied with the descriptions of his building operations. He rebuilt scores of the ancient temples, surrounded many cities with walls, lined the shores of the rivers with embankments, and spanned the rivers with bridges. Tradition says that to please his foreign wife from the mountainous country, he built the famous Hanging Gardens, but that may be only a tradition. His palace in Babylon was one of the world's largest buildings, but the walls with which he protected his palace and city were the wonder of the whole world. The ancients never tired of describing them. Fortunately, in several of his long inscriptions recently discovered in the Babylonian mounds, Nebuchadnezzar speaks of the building of the walls. In one of them he says, "I completed Imgur-Bel and Nimiti-Bel, the great walls of Babylon, the mighty city, the city of his exalted power. At the entrance of the great gates I erected strong bulls of bronze and terrible serpents standing upright. My father did that which no previous king had done. With mortar and bricks he built 2 moat walls about the city, and I, with mortar and bricks, built a 3rd great moat wall, and joined it and united it closely with the moat walls of my father. I laid its foundation deep to the water level. I raised its summit mountain high. I constructed a moat wall of burned bricks about the west wall of Babylon. My father built the moat wall of the Araktu Canal securely with mortar and bricks. He built well the quays along the opposite shore of the Euphrates, but he did not finish all his work. But I, his firstborn, the beloved of his heart, built the moat walls of Araktu with mortar and bricks, and, joining them together with those of my father, made them very solid, a thing which no king before had ever done. To the west of Babylon, at a greater distance from the outer wall, I constructed an enclosing wall 4,000 cubits in length about the city. I dug its moat to the water level. I walled up its side with mortar and burned bricks, and I united it securely with the moat walls of my father. Along its edge I built a great wall of mortar and burned bricks mountain high." Berosus, a priest of the temple of Bel at Babylon, writing about 250 B.C., was living in the city while the walls were still standing, though in a ruinous condition. His brief description of them should not be omitted. He says that Nebuchadnezzar built 3 walls round about the inner city, and 3 others about that which was the outer, and this he did with burnt brick. And after he had walled the city and adorned its gates, he built another palace before his father's palace, but so that they joined to it, to describe whose vast height and immense riches it would perhaps be too much for me to attempt. Yet, as large and lofty as they were completed in 15 days. He also erected elevated places for walking of stone, and made it resemble mountains, and built it so that it might be planted with all sorts of trees. He also erected what is called a pensile paradise, because his wife was desirous to have things like her own country, she having been bred up in the palaces of Medea. Of all the ancient descriptions of the famous walls and the city they protected, that of Herodotus is the fullest. Perhaps Herodotus had never been in Babylon. Perhaps the tales that travelers told him were exaggerated, as travelers' tales are likely to be. Yet he at least tried to be accurate. He says, "The city stands on a broad plain, and is an exact square, 120 furlongs in length each way, so that the entire circuit is 480 furlongs. While such is its size, in magnificence there is no other city that approaches to it. It is surrounded, in the first place, by a broad and deep moat, full of water, behind which rises a wall, 50 royal cubits in width and 200 in height. And here I may not omit to tell the use to which the mould dug out of the great moat was turned, nor the manner wherein the wall was wrought. As fast as they dug the moat, the soil which they got from the cutting was made into bricks, and when a sufficient number were completed, they baked the bricks in kilns. Then they set to building, and began by bricking the borders of the moat, after which they proceeded to construct the wall itself, using throughout for their cement hot bitumen, and interposing a layer of wattled reeds at every 30th course of the bricks. On the top, along the edges of the wall, they constructed buildings of a single chamber facing one another, leaving between them room for a 4-horse chariot to turn. In the circuit of the wall are 100 gates, all of brass, with brazen lintels and side-posts. The bitumen used in the work was brought to Babylon from Is, a small stream which flows into the Euphrates at the point where the city of the same name stands, 8 days' journey from Babylon. Lumps of bitumen are found in great abundance in this river. The city is divided into 2 portions by the river which runs through the midst of it. This river is the Euphrates, a broad, deep, swift stream which rises in Armenia and empties itself into the Erythraean Sea. The city wall is brought down on both sides to the edge of the stream. Thence from the corners of the wall there is carried along each bank of the river a fence of burnt bricks. The houses are mostly 3 and 4 stories high. The streets all run in straight lines, not only those parallel to the river, but also the cross streets which lead down to the water side. At the river end of these cross streets are low gates in the fence that skirts the stream, which are, like the great gates in the outer wall, of brass and open on the water. The outer wall is the main defense of the city. There is, however, a second inner wall of less thickness than the first, but very little inferior to it in strength. The center of each division of the town is occupied by a fortress. In the one stood the palace of the kings, surrounded by a wall of great strength and size. In the other was the sacred precinct of Jupiter Belus, a square enclosure 2 furlongs each way, with gates of solid brass, which was also remaining in my time. In the middle of the precinct there was a tower of solid masonry, a furlong in length and breadth, upon which was raised a second tower, and on that a third, and so on up to 8. The ascent to the top is on the outside, by a path which winds round all the towers. When one is about halfway up, one finds a resting place and seats where persons are wont to sit sometimes on their way to the summit. Other ancient descriptions of the walls have been left us by Ctesias of the 5th century BC and by Strabo of the beginning of the Christian era, but they add little to our knowledge. Should we compare these ancient descriptions of the walls, we should find them hopelessly conflicting. However, they teach us that, in those early days when most cities were surrounded by enormous walls, the walls of Babylon were so long and wide and high that all who saw them were amazed. It is only from their ruins that we may hope to obtain accurate information of the strongest fortifications in the ancient world. In the year 562, after a long reign of 43 years, Nebuchadnezzar died. He was followed by 3 kings whose reigns were short, and in 555 Nabonidus, the father of the biblical Belshazzar, came to the throne. Cyrus, the king of Persia, was rising to power, and after he had defeated the Medes, he extended his empire to the Mediterranean and even to Egypt. Perhaps Babylon was so strongly fortified that at first he made no attempt to add it to his empire. But when Nabonidus joined with the king of Egypt and with the wealthy Croesus of Lydia in an alliance against him, Cyrus decided that Babylon must be taken. In 538 the city fell, and for a time it became the home of the Persian king. The fall of Babylon with its lofty walls was a most important event in the history of the ancient world. A great empire which had existed for more than 3,000 years was brought to an end. The old enemies of Babylon rejoiced. When the news came to the Hebrews, who were held there in exile, they excitedly rushed about the streets, crying, "Babylon is fallen!" and to them came hope of returning to Jerusalem. But how did the mighty city fall? How could Cyrus take Babylon, whose walls were strong enough to resist any army? It is a long story. Poets have sung it, historians have written it, prophets have preached it, legends have gathered about it. Every child knows the story of the writing of the hand on the wall. It was the night that Babylon fell. Belshazzar the king, he was really the king's son, gave a feast to 1,000 of his nobles. In the great banquet hall of the palace, when the guests were drinking from the golden cups and the revelry was at its highest, there suddenly appeared upon the wall an armless hand. High up, where all might see it, the armless hand wrote the king's fate. "Thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting." In that night, so the story ends, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. Less picturesque than this Hebrew legend is the royal record of Babylon, which fortunately was inscribed upon a clay cylinder from the ruins of the city. It refers to the death of the king's son, possibly to Belshazzar of the Bible story. In the month Tammuz, when Cyrus fought the troops of Akkad, Babylonia, at Opis on the river Salsallat, he subdued the people, and wherever they collected he slew them. On the 14th day, Sippar was taken without a battle. Nabonidus fled. On the 16th day the troops of Cyrus entered Babylon without a battle. Nabonidus was taken prisoner in Babylon. On the 3rd of Marchesvan, Cyrus entered Babylon and proclaimed peace to all the city. He appointed Gobryas governor of Babylon. On the night of the 11th day, Gobryas killed the son of the king. Nor does the royal record of Babylon contain the only contemporary account of the fall of the city, for upon a barrel-shaped cylinder of clay bearing a long inscription, we have Cyrus's account of his capture of Babylon. Extracts from it are as follows. Marduk, the great lord, looking with joy on his pious works and upright heart, commanded him, Cyrus, to go forth to his city Babylon, and he went by his side as a friend and companion. His many troops, whose number, like the waters of the river, could not be counted, marched in full armor at his side. Without a skirmish or a battle, he permitted them to enter Babylon, and, sparing the city, he delivered the king Nabonidus to him. All the people of Babylon prostrated themselves before him, and, kissing his feet, rejoiced in his sovereignty, while happiness shone on their faces. The inscription continues: I am Cyrus, king of the world. When I made my gracious entry into Babylon, with exceeding joy I took up my abode in the royal palace. My many troops marched peacefully into Babylon. I gave heed to the needs of Babylon and its cities, and the servitude of the Babylonians. Whatever was oppressive, I removed from them. I quieted their sighings and soothed their sorrows. A much longer account of the capture of Babylon by Cyrus appears in the writings of Herodotus. Though Herodotus wrote nearly 100 years after Babylon fell, his story seems to bear the stamp of truth. He certainly mentions details which neither Nabonidus nor Cyrus would care to have appear in their royal records. His story is as follows. Cyrus, with the first approach of the ensuing spring, marched forward against Babylon. The Babylonians, encamped without their walls, awaited his coming. A battle was fought at a short distance from the city, in which the Babylonians were defeated by the Persian king, whereupon they withdrew within their defences. Here they shut themselves up and made light of his siege, having laid in a store of provision for many years in preparation against this attack. For when they saw Cyrus conquering nation after nation, they were convinced that he would never stop, and their turn would come at last. Cyrus was now reduced to great perplexity, as time went on and he made no progress against the place. In this distress, either someone made this suggestion to him, or he bethought himself of a plan which he proceeded to put in execution. He placed a portion of his army at the point where the river enters the city, and another body at the back of the place where it issues forth, with orders to march into the town by the bed of the stream, as soon as the water became shallow enough. He then himself drew off with the unwarlike portion of his host, and made for the place where Nitocris dug the basin for the river, where he did exactly what she had done formerly. He turned the Euphrates by a canal into the basin, which was then a marsh, on which the river sank to such an extent that the natural bed of the stream became fordable. Hereupon the Persians, who had been left for the purpose at Babylon by the riverside, entered the stream, which had now sunk so as to reach about midway up a man's thigh, and thus got into the town. Had the Babylonians been apprised of what Cyrus was about, or had they noticed their danger, they would never have allowed the Persians to enter the city, but would have destroyed them utterly, for they would have made fast all the street gates which gave upon the river, and, mounting upon the walls along both sides of the stream, would so have caught the enemy as it were in a trap. But, as it was, the Persians came upon them by surprise, and so took the city. Owing to the vast size of the place, the inhabitants of the central parts, as the residents of Babylon declare, long after the outer portions of the town were taken, knew nothing of what had chanced, but, as they were engaged in a festival, continued dancing and reveling until they learned the capture but too certainly. Such, then, were the circumstances of the first taking of Babylon. When Cyrus took Babylon, little or no force was employed. Only the king's son, Belshazzar, was killed. The city was spared, the great walls were left standing. The daily sacrifices were continued in the temples, and Cyrus made his home in the royal palace. The people, enjoying the greater freedom which Cyrus permitted them, were contented, and life in Babylon went on about as before. In 529 Cyrus died. During the reigns of the two following Persian kings, Babylon was slowly regaining its independence, and in 521 Nebuchadnezzar III, a native Babylonian, was placed on the throne. Then the Babylonians secretly plotted to throw off the Persian yoke. That same year, when Darius Hystaspes came to the Persian throne, the Babylonians openly rebelled. The following story from Herodotus tells the results. At last, when the time came for rebelling openly, they did as follows. Having first set apart their mothers, each man chose, besides out of his whole household, one woman whomsoever he pleased. These alone were allowed to live, while all the rest were brought to one place and strangled. The women chosen were kept to make bread for the men, while the others were strangled that they might not consume the stores. When tidings reached Darius of what had happened, he drew together all his power and began the war by marching straight upon Babylon and laying siege to the place. The Babylonians, however, cared not a whit for his siege. Mounting upon the battlements that crowned their walls, they insulted and jeered at Darius and his mighty host. One even shouted to them and said, "Why sit ye there, Persians? Why do ye not go back to your homes? Till mules foal ye will not take our city." This was said by a Babylonian, who thought that a mule would never foal. Now, when 1 year and 7 months had passed, Darius and his army were quite wearied out, finding that they could not anyhow take the city. All stratagems and all arts had been used, and yet the king could not prevail, not even when he tried the means by which Cyrus had made himself master of the place. The Babylonians were ever upon the watch, and he found no way of conquering them. At last, in the 20th month, a marvelous thing happened to Zopyrus, son of the Megabyzus, who was among the 7 men that overthrew the Magus. One of his sumpter mules gave birth to a foal. Zopyrus, when they told him, not thinking that it could be true, went and saw the colt with his own eyes, after which he commanded his servants to tell no one what had come to pass, while he himself pondered the matter. Calling to mind then the words of the Babylonian at the beginning of the siege, "Till mules foal ye shall not take our city," he thought, as he reflected on this speech, that Babylon might now be taken, for it seemed to him that there was a divine providence in the man having used the phrase, and then his mule having foaled. As soon, therefore, as he felt within himself that Babylon was fated to be taken, he went to Darius and asked him if he set a very high value on its conquest. When he found that Darius did indeed value it highly, he considered further with himself how he might make the deed his own, and be the man to take Babylon. Noble exploits in Persia are ever highly honored and bring their authors to greatness. He therefore reviewed all ways of bringing the city under, but found none by which he could hope to prevail, unless he maimed himself and then went over to the enemy. To do this seeming to him a light matter, he mutilated himself in a way that was utterly without remedy. For he cut off his own nose and ears, and then, clipping his hair close and flogging himself with a scourge, he came in this plight before Darius. Wrath stirred within the king at the sight of a man of his lofty rank in such a condition. Leaping down from his throne, he exclaimed aloud, and asked Zopyrus who it was that had disfigured him, and what he had done to be so treated. Zopyrus answered, "There is not a man in the world but thou, O king, that could reduce me to such a plight. No stranger's hands have wrought this work on me, but my own only. I maimed myself, because I could not endure that the Assyrians should laugh at the Persians." "Wretched man," said Darius, "thou coverest the foulest deeds with the fairest possible name, when thou sayest thy maiming is to help our siege forward. How will thy disfigurement, thou simpleton, induce the enemy to yield one day sooner? Surely thou hadst gone out of thy mind when thou didst so misuse thyself." "Had I told thee," rejoined the other, "what I was bent on doing, thou wouldst not have suffered it. As it is, I kept my own counsel, and so accomplished my plans. Now, therefore, if there be no failure on thy part, we shall take Babylon. I will desert to the enemy as I am, and when I get into their city, I will tell them that it is by thee that I have been thus treated. I think they will believe my words, and entrust me with a command of troops. Thou, on thy part, must wait till the 10th day after I am entered within the town, and then place near to the gates of Semiramis a detachment of thy army, troops for whose loss thou wilt care little, 1,000 men. Wait after that 7 days, and post me another detachment, 2,000 strong, at the Nineveh gates. Then let 20 days pass, and at the end of that time station near the Chaldean gates a body of 4,000. Let neither these nor the former troops be armed with any weapons but their swords. Those thou mayest leave them. After the 20 days are over, bid thy whole army attack the city on every side, and put me 2 bodies of Persians, one at the Belian, the other at the Sicyan gates. For I expect that, on account of my successes, the Babylonians will entrust everything, even the keys of their gates, to me. Then it will be for me and my Persians to do the rest." Having left these instructions, Zopyrus fled towards the gates of the town, often looking back to give himself the air of a deserter. The men upon the towers, whose business it was to keep a lookout, observing him, hastened down, and setting one of the gates slightly ajar, questioned him who he was, and on what errand he had come. He replied that he was Zopyrus, and deserted to them from the Persians. Then the doorkeepers, when they heard this, carried him at once before the magistrates. Introduced into their assembly, he began to bewail his misfortunes, telling them that Darius had maltreated him in the way they could see, only because he had given advice that the siege should be raised, since there seemed no hope of taking the city. "And now," he went on to say, "my coming to you, Babylonians, will prove the greatest gain that you could possibly receive, while to Darius and the Persians it will be the severest loss. Verily, he by whom I have been so mutilated shall not escape unpunished, and truly all the paths of his counsels are known to me." Thus did Zopyrus speak. The Babylonians, seeing a Persian of such exalted rank in so grievous a plight, his nose and ears cut off, his body red with marks of scourging and with blood, had no suspicion but that he spoke the truth, and was really come to be their friend and helper. They were ready, therefore, to grant him anything he asked, and, on his suing for a command, they entrusted to him a body of troops, with the help of which he proceeded to do as he had arranged with Darius. On the 10th day after his flight, he led out his detachment, and, surrounding the 1,000 men, whom Darius, according to agreement, had sent first, he fell upon them and slew them all. Then the Babylonians, seeing that his deeds were as brave as his words, were beyond measure pleased, and set no bounds to their trust. He waited, however, and when the next period agreed on had elapsed, again with a band of picked men he sallied forth and slaughtered the 2,000. After this second exploit his praise was in all mouths. Once more, however, he waited till the interval appointed had gone by, and then, leading the troops to the place where the 4,000 were, he put them also to the sword. This last victory gave him the finishing stroke to his power, and made him all in all with the Babylonians. Accordingly, they committed to him the command of their whole army, and put the keys of their city into his hands. Darius now, still keeping to the plan agreed upon, attacked the walls on every side, whereupon Zopyrus played out the remainder of his stratagem. While the Babylonians, crowding to the walls, did their best to resist the Persian assault, he threw open the Sicyan and Belian gates and admitted the enemy. Such of the Babylonians as witnessed the treachery took refuge in the temple of Jupiter Belus. The rest, who did not see it, kept at their posts, till at last they too learned that they were betrayed. Thus was Babylon taken for the second time. Darius, having become master of the place, destroyed the wall and tore down all the gates, for Cyrus had done neither the one nor the other when he took Babylon. He then chose out near 3,000 of the leading citizens and caused them to be crucified, while he allowed the remainder still to inhabit the city. Further, wishing to prevent the race of the Babylonians from becoming extinct, he provided wives for them in the room of those whom, as I explained before, they strangled to save their stores. These he levied from the nations bordering on Babylonia, who were each required to send so large a number to Babylon that in all there were collected no fewer than 50,000. It is from these women that the Babylonians of our times are sprung. As for Zopyrus, he was considered by Darius to have surpassed, in the greatness of his achievements, all other Persians, whether of former or of later times, except only Cyrus, with whom no person ever yet thought himself worthy to compare. Darius, as the story goes, would often say that he had rather Zopyrus were unmaimed than be master of 20 more Babylons. And he honored Zopyrus greatly. Year by year he presented him with all the gifts which are held in most esteem among the Persians. He gave him likewise the government of Babylon for his life, free from tribute, and he also granted him many other favors. How much truth there may be in this interesting tale of Herodotus we may never know, yet we may be sure that Babylon was taken by Darius only by use of stratagem. Its walls were impregnable. Cyrus had permitted them to stand, and as long as he made Babylon his home, the city was as strongly protected as ever. Darius, who besieged the rebellious city twice, weakened it by destroying some of its walls. During the reign of Xerxes, again the city rebelled, and in 484 B.C. he captured it and completely demolished its defenses. Yet Babylon continued to live, for history mentions the names of 2 of its later rulers. The palace of Nebuchadnezzar was occupied by Alexander the Great, and there on June 13, 323 B.C., he met his death. The city then fell to Seleucus, one of Alexander's generals, who for a time made it his home, but he was a Greek and cared little for things Babylonian. Therefore, to destroy the power of the old capital, he planned to build Seleucia on the Tigris, about 50 miles to the east. The priests of the temple of Bel, so a story tells us, learned of his purpose, and when they were consulted as to the most favorable time for beginning the work upon the new city, they intentionally mentioned a most unfavorable hour. The priests' deception was unavailing, and in 275 B.C. the inhabitants of Babylon were transported to Seleucia. Then the world metropolis, stripped of most of its population, became a mere village. The poor of the surrounding country occupied its dismantled palaces. The Hebrew exiles, whose ancestors Nebuchadnezzar had brought from Jerusalem, settled there, and finally the place was abandoned to the Arabs of the desert. Slowly, the few remaining walls fell and were buried in their own ruins. As the centuries passed, the mounds into which the city had turned grew higher and higher with the ruins of the huts later built upon them, until at last the foundations of the temples and palaces were buried fully 100 feet beneath the surface. Even the shepherds ceased to graze their sheep there, and the wandering Arabs, fearing the wild beasts and evil spirits which lurk among all old ruins, refused to pitch their tents there. The prophecy of the Hebrew Isaiah was fulfilled. Wild beasts of the desert shall lie there, and their houses shall be full of doleful creatures, and owls shall dwell there, and satyrs shall dance there, and the wild beasts of the islands shall cry in their desolate houses, and dragons in their pleasant palaces. So Babylon was buried and forgotten. It had become, as Dio Cassius said, mounds and legends and ruins. But the walls of the old city had not yet served their full purpose. The Sasanian kings of Persia were fond of hunting, and Babylon, then overgrown with trees, was their game preserve. The old walls were restored to a height sufficient to prevent the escape of the animals, and among the ruins the kings enjoyed their favorite sport. St. Jerome said, "I was informed by a certain Elamite brother, who came from those regions and now leads the life of a monk at Jerusalem, that there is a royal hunting ground at Babylon, and that wild game of every kind is contained within the circuit of its walls." The statement of St. Jerome is confirmed by the following passage from Zosimus, a Greek writer of the 5th century A.D. As the Emperor Julian was marching forward through Babylonia, he passed other unimportant fortresses and came at last to a walled enclosure which the natives pointed out as a royal hunting ground. It was a low rampart enclosing a wide space planted with trees of every sort, in which all kinds of beasts were shut up. They were supplied with food by keepers, and gave the king the opportunity of hunting whenever he felt inclined. When Julian saw this, he caused a large part of the wall to be overthrown, and as the beasts escaped, they were shot down by his soldiers. The walls of Babylon were destined to serve still another purpose. The spread of Mohammedanism caused new cities to be built, and Babylon was the quarry for their building material. The walls of Babylon were transformed into the sacred cities of Kerbela and Negev. In the 11th century, on the site of the southern part of Babylon, the city of Hilla was built. Hilla might be called a child of Babylon, for it is almost entirely constructed with Nebuchadnezzar's bricks. The walls of the houses are built of them. The courtyards and streets are paved with them. And as you walk about the city, the name of Nebuchadnezzar everywhere meets your eye. Many of the 10,000 people living in Hilla still gain their livelihood by digging the bricks from the ruins to sell to the modern builders. The great irrigating dams across the Euphrates are constructed entirely of them. The people of Hilla, too, are a survival of Babylonian times. Some are Arabs of the same tribes which used to roam the desert in Nebuchadnezzar's days. Some are the children of the Hebrew exiles of old. Some, calling themselves Christians, are the descendants of Babylonians, perhaps of Nebuchadnezzar himself. There among the ruins they still live in the same kind of houses, dressing the same, eating the same food as did their ancestors when Nebuchadnezzar built the walls of Babylon. Among the first of the modern travelers to describe the ruins of Babylon was Anthony Shirley, an Englishman who visited Mesopotamia in 1599. In his quaint way he says, "All the ground on which Babylon was spread is left now desolate, nothing standing in that peninsula between the Euphrates and the Tigris, but only part, and that a small part, of the great tower which God hath suffered to stand, if man may speak so confidently of his great impenetrable counsels, for an eternal testimony of his great work in the confusion of man's pride, and that ark of Nebuchadnezzar for as perpetual a memory of his great idolatry and condign punishment." About that same time, Pietro della Valle, an Italian, visited Babylon, and digging from the wall an inscribed square brick bearing the name of Nebuchadnezzar, he took it to Rome, where it may still be seen. That was the first object taken from Babylon to Europe. It was the beginning of the great collections of Babylonian antiquities in the museums of the Western world. Among the later visitors to Babylon was the great Niebuhr. In 1812, James Claudius Rich, the British resident at Baghdad, made the first complete examination of the ruins. Porter, Layard, and Rawlinson followed him, but the real scientific exploration of Babylon and its walls was begun by the Deutsche Orientgesellschaft in 1889 and continued till the summer of 1915. For 15 years, Dr. Koldewey and his assistants, with a force of 200 native workmen, have labored there winter and summer. The enormous amount of debris which buried the palaces and temples and walls of Nebuchadnezzar's city, in places to the depth of 100 feet, has been removed, and the surrounding city walls have been traced. The excavations have shown that Babylon, as the ancients told us, was nearly square. The Euphrates flowed through it. but the greater part of the city was on the eastern shore. The city walls, of which the ancients were so proud, appear here and there like low ridges far out on the plain. Other parts of them have disappeared entirely. In the northern part of the enclosure, to the east of the river, the large high mound, which resembles a mountain from a distance, still bears the ancient name Babel. Arabs, searching for bricks, have burrowed their way down deep into it, revealing massive walls and arches. The Germans maintain that it is the ruin of the Tower of Babel. Here, it has been suggested, were the famous hanging gardens which some ancient authors included among the 7 wonders of the world. However, it is possible that the hanging gardens existed only in the imagination of the Greek writers, for none of the many buildings inscriptions from Nebuchadnezzar mentions them. Possibly along the terraces of the walls, or upon the stages of some lofty temple tower, trees and overhanging vines were planted, and thus the travellers' tales arose. At a distance of about 2 miles to the south of Babel is the larger and lower mound called the Kasr, or the fortress, because great masses of masonry used to project from its surface. Deep down in the mound, the Germans discovered the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, with its hundreds of small chambers and its huge surrounding walls. The mound still farther south is called Amran, because upon its summit stands the tomb of a Mohammedan saint of that name. There lie the ruins of the famous temple of Esagil, sacred to Marduk. Upon the little mound Jumjuma farther on, an Arab village has long stood. All of the ancient writers agree in saying that Babylon was surrounded with both inner and outer walls, and the ruins confirm their statements. Parts of the walls of Nineveh are still standing to the height of 125 feet, but the walls of Babylon have so long been used to supply bricks to the builders of the neighboring cities that only their bases remain. In places even the bases have disappeared, and their moats have long been filled with the drifting sand. The outer wall bore the name of Nimiti Bel. Its direction was northeast and southwest, forming a triangle with the river. The northeastern section may now be traced for a distance of less than 3 miles, and the southwestern for more than a mile, but both sections originally reached the river. It seems that the circuit of the outer wall was about 11 miles. The small portions of it, which have been excavated, suffice to show its construction. The moat, 10 feet deep, and of a width no longer known, ran close to its base. The wall was double. Its outer part was about 24 feet in thickness, and its foundations, as Nebuchadnezzar said, were carried down to the water level. Its bricks, measuring about 13 inches square and 3 inches in thickness, were burned and stamped with the usual short inscription, "Nebuchadnezzar, King of Babylon, the restorer of the temples Isagal and Izida, the firstborn son of Nabopolassar, King of Babylon." They were laid in bitumen. The inner part of the wall was constructed of unburned bricks, and at a distance of about 36 feet from the outer part. The intervening space, which was filled with dirt, probably to the upper inner edge of the outer part, served as an elevated road where several chariots might have been driven abreast. This inner part was about 24 feet wide, and at intervals of about 140 feet it was surmounted with towers. The entire width of the outer defense, not including the moat, was therefore about 82 feet. Its height was probably more than double its width, but that may never be determined. The inner wall of Babylon was called Imgurbel, and like the outer wall it was double. Time has dealt even less kindly with it, for it may be traced only for the distance of about a mile along its eastern side. Nebuchadnezzar says that he built it of burned bricks, but only sun-dried bricks laid in mud now appear. Its outer part, about 12 feet in width, was protected with towers at intervals of 65 feet. A space of about 23 feet separated it from its inner part, which was about 20 feet in width. It, too, was surmounted with towers. No traces of its moat have appeared. The entire width of this inner defence was about 55 feet. Its height is uncertain. To protect the sun-dried bricks of the inner wall from the winter rains, there were drains of large burned bricks, some of which bore the following long inscription: Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the exalted prince, the protector of Isagil and Izida, son of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon am I. Nabopolassar, the father, my begetter, built Imgur-Bel, the great wall of Babylon, but I, the devout petitioner, the worshipper of the gods, built the moat, and made its wall of burned brick and bitumen mountain high. O Marduk, great God, look joyfully upon the precious work of my hands. Be thou my protector. Grant me as a gift a life of distant days. The outer and inner defences of Babylon were so strong and so high that no enemy could hope to take them. Yet the palace of Nebuchadnezzar was protected by a third defence far stronger. Fortunately, its walls have suffered less from the hands of the brick hunters, and the German excavators have been able to reconstruct their plan. They may best be described by means of the accompanying diagram representing a cross-section. Had the enemy of Babylon succeeded in breaking through the outer and inner defences of the city, the royal palace would have still been far from his reach. He would have had to cross a deep moat, to scale a wall of burned bricks about 20 feet in thickness and perhaps 3 times as high, then a second wall still higher, a third and fourth, and a fifth, each stronger and higher than the others, and surmounted with towers, and then, finally, a sixth wall whose summit reached into the sky as far, perhaps, as the tallest of the modern buildings. Between the several sections were wide spaces where foot soldiers and charioteers might fight. It must have been an imposing sight to one standing without to have seen the walls, one after another, rising higher and higher, like a great terraced, turreted mountain. We do not know their height, for the statements of the ancient writers disagree. Herodotus says that it was 335 feet. Ctesias mentions 300 feet. Probably they were not far from the truth. The ruins reach the height of about 40 feet. Nor were the walls about the palace a great mass of dull brick masonry. The Ishtar gateway leading to the palace was encased with beautiful blue glazed bricks, and decorated here and there with large reliefs representing bulls and lions and dragons, designed in colors of white and blue and yellow and black. It seems that the bricks of the reliefs were molded and glazed separately and so accurately that when built into the wall they fitted perfectly. A modern artist would have difficulty in doing such accurate work. Some of these decorations, the most valuable objects found in the ruins of the great city, still remain in their places on the walls. Others have been taken to the Berlin Museum. Nebuchadnezzar speaks of great bronze gates and of images of bronze, but none have been discovered. Probably their metal was far too valuable for the enemy to leave behind. Should you walk along the shore of the Euphrates at Babylon, you would still see the embankments which Nebuchadnezzar constructed of bricks bearing his name. But the river walls have disappeared, and the buttresses of the bridges have been torn or washed away. Should you cross the river to search for the western inner wall, you would find but a small fragment of it. The great outer wall seems to have disappeared completely beneath the desert surface. Such were the walls of Babylon, the strongest, the thickest, the loftiest, the most intricate, perhaps the most beautiful that ever protected a city, walls which no ancient army was ever able to take by storm. It is not strange, then, that they were included among the seven wonders of the world, or that the Babylonian soldier stood confidently upon their summit, and jeering at the Persian army encamped below, shouted, "Why sit ye there, Persians? Why do ye not go back to your homes? Till mules foal ye will not take our city."
We hope you enjoyed this video. Please let us know in the comments what other art contents you would like to see. And don't forget to like this video and follow our channel. Thank you, and until the next video.